We have two of my colleagues joining us for this panel. Jürgen Heinrichs, who teaches in our program, and you met Petra Chu earlier today. So we welcome them. Right now. So I'll throw out the first question now for the panel and also for the audience. One question that's been on my mind today is how all of these papers engage with the question of ownership in the museum, how ownership is changing or should change in the museum in terms of ethical issues. And I'm wondering if any of the speakers have ideas about this or any of the other panelists.
Well, do we want to clarify ownership of ethical issues? Or I think some of it was
Ownership in the museum, ownership of objects in the museum, ownership
right.
of objects, how that is changing. Question of ownership and possession.
I mean, I guess in the spirit of Carlo's question, there are, I guess, a number of sets of senses of ownership, of course, right? I mean, there is like actual legal title. And then there, I think it's what you're kind of pointing towards, is sort of moral or ethical ownership. Or I guess maybe some kind of relation that involves the responsibility of the institution to you and of you to the object. I mean, to speak very abstractly, I guess. One issue that usually, one issue that sometimes troubles me, or in terms of which I tend to think about a lot of, or a number of the ethical issues I'm interested in museums, has to do with sort of treating, and you were talking about objects, treating objects not instrumentally or not only instrumentally, but somehow acknowledging objects as having value, and I don't even know how to state this exactly, sort of non-instrumental value. In the case of artworks, there are aesthetic values. In the case of ethnographic objects, there are cultural values, connections to other peoples, et cetera. So a lot of the sort of, I'm sorry, this is so abstract. A lot of the sort of changes within museum behavior vis-a-vis their collections have to do with sort of connections with individuals and using those objects to obtain certain ends. And publicity, fundraising, social change, et cetera. And I guess in the most abstract terms, that's one thing that I think about. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. But it somehow seems connected with ownership to me.
well, there's also the ownership as it's been played out recently in terms of the political aspects of nationhood and trying to help to move along agendas that really where the artwork is purely instrumental, but not in a way that we think of it, but in a sort of political football kind of way. I like the bust of Nefertiti, for instance. Who owns Nefertiti? And that kind of consideration, which, we really didn't get into those issues in the papers today, but those are certainly going to increase as the political situation in the world continues to evolve.
Could I kind of throw out a term that I'm kind of inventing at the moment? Emotional ownership. I think that, there's of course legal ownership. We can't do really too much about that. There is, the idea of, cultural ownership, and we can say, well, humanity owns it all, and so we all own everything. But I think there are degrees of that, and I think there are certain objects that have an incredible emotional value to certain groups, and that kind of emotional ownership, I think, is something that where a lot of the arguments come about. I mean, that's why I was interested about the Bogman, why it would be more meaningful to people in Manchester than in London. It sounds ridiculous to us. It's a purely emotional question, of course. The same is true with Nefertiti. I mean, the people who are living now in Egypt, are not in any way related to the ancient Egyptians, but still emotionally they feel that they have something with that bust. So that's
Or at
kind
least their director of archaeology does, right?
Yeah, I mean, even one thing is that there's a sort of the one questioning the value and questioning ownership. It may be a shift, relational in that sense, contextual. And even if we move away from issues of ownership to issues of, looking at it in terms of possession or stewardship or guardianship or one of these other kinds of terms, I mean, a couple of things, even when we're talking today, when we talk about stakeholders, the word stakeholders implies people like having a stake in, right? Owning some part of, right? They're taking ownership or feel a sense of ownership towards. So even when we talk about stakeholders, we still aren't getting necessarily away from, and it's not a good or bad thing, but not necessarily away from that sort of sense of rights to, or, on some kind of level. And I guess with regard to issues like whether we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about stewardship, one of the things that a lot of the papers brought up today, which I think is a really interesting and is where the debate needs to be more and really go, is the issue of stewardship. Okay, well, if we move towards stewardship rather than ownership, well, it's stewardship for whom? Because that's what it's always about. It's not just this sort of abstract concept of stewardship, right, or guardianship, but it's stewardship for particular ends, stewardship for particular stakeholders, stewardship for particular agendas, et cetera. So I think that publics, and that's what a lot of the papers brought out today, which I think is really interesting, is that it was really trying to situate. It was a sort of a situational stewardship of the art and the meanings and values, et cetera.
Just add one bit to that. Seems to me that what's happened in the last few decades is complicating the notion of I bought it, I own it, I can do whatever I want with it. So what does it mean to buy something and to own it? It used to mean you had control over it. Now it just means that you have a voice in what happens to that object. And there might be lots of other people, whether it's the artist, whether it's the culture it came from, even though they don't have physical ownership and they don't have a receipt and legal title to it, they have a moral ownership to it that in some ways occasionally can trump the legal financial ownership, and sometimes it just means that there's a sharing that has to go on. That it's no simple way anymore of saying I own it, it's mine. It can be the property of all humanity, or it can be the property of that tribe, or the moral property of an artist. It's sort of much more interesting now.
In that sense, when Heather Hope quoted the change in the definition, the Black's Law's Dictionary, about property, I mean, I thought that was totally fascinating, right? That it really, the new definition is much more streamlined and emphasizes the sort of right of possession,
Right,
and to do things. So it's these rights of how to interact with, but it's not sort of the same kind of real domination of sovereignty over something in the sense that the previous definition was, which is really interesting, broader perhaps impact, because if it's happening not just among the cultural property community, but it's happening in property law in general, is a real interesting shift that might be worth exploring also.
Because it's also more vague and more open to any interpretation.
In some ways, it's happening with property law or real estate law, that all the environmental rules. The one place it's going backwards seems to be intellectual property law, where copyright keeps getting narrower and narrower and more constricted, and ownership is less easy to contest. Not sure what to make of
For museums, I think there's something interesting about the buildings we work in, and the architecture and the galleries and pieces and so on, and the mindset that that generates, and the way that that's being shifted with digital media, because some of the presentations about that today were about how you lose control and you lose ownership once something's in the public domain through Twitter or whatever the media is. And I think maybe that's going to shift the way people think about owning or stewarding or whatever, that suddenly it becomes a much broader deal. It becomes something that other people have more than a stake in, actually. It's actually theirs to do with whatever they want. So I think there's going to be a change in the way people think about it because of that. But meanwhile, we all still live in these boxes, and we work in these boxes, and they make us think in particular ways.
He's not part of the panel. Why is he not part of the panel? Because I was thinking again. I was thinking, what? Oh, I see. Because I was thinking when you're talking about the issue of, yes, we have these new media. Yes, we have these new, online. There's sort of this much more fluid or flexible kinds of ownership. But yet, what are the constraints? The material constraints. Again, going back to materiality, right? It's one thing when you can have a photograph of an object and anybody can manipulate that photograph or whatever, but what about that single object that the photograph is of? And somehow there's ways of interacting with that are going to be necessarily different. And how do we reconcile the sort of the wall that we hit up against, the materiality of it, versus in some of these other emerging contexts?
And I think with the digital object as well, it's the kind of art that I'm dealing with is infinitely reproducible, right? And so we can reproduce it, and it is essentially the same object. So we're confronting new situations daily with the artists that are creating digital media. One of them, recently, we acquired a work, and the artist insisted that we not photograph it, nor that we have a wall label for it when we exhibit it. And originally he wanted us not to allow the public to photograph it either, or put images up on the website. But he also didn't want our guards to tell the public not to photograph it. So in the end, we just said, we can't do that because you're putting us in a box here, and it's not our MoMA can't be in the position of policing its public. Basically, we can't go after people from their websites and tell them they need to take an image of our work of art down. That's just one instance. Another instance is where several museums at the same time have requested loans of the same object, and we could do that because we can send them each a DVD, essentially. But in some cases, the artist only wants it to be exhibited in one place at one time. So we're constantly faced with new permutations of what ownership means and what the rights means. That's what one of the things I've been thinking of a lot today, especially with these two legal presentations, are the rights that museums have, particularly with digital art and video art, to reproduce the works, to loan the works. And there's no set rule. I think we're at a moment where we're inventing the rules as we go, hopefully with good lawyers on both sides. But another situation that I just thought about is a work of art that came in with a DVD, a commercial DVD of a work by Madonna. And we're supposed to play the DVD when we show the sculpture. And I'm not sure we have the rights to reproduce that DVD, to loan it to other museums. So this is something that hasn't even come up yet. sort of. No. Absolutely. I mean, I think so. And we have, since it hasn't come up yet, we haven't had to face it, but I'm sure we will.
I have another question, which is, what's missing from today? What's missing from these talks? What haven't we discussed? Which is also a really important question.
So the question is, what's missing from today? And my concern about what's missing, in some ways this is a pedagogical concern, is that it's very easy for papers to lay out possibilities and options and say there are lots of ways to do this and these are the ethical issues. But I'm thinking of those same students in 10 years when they're directors of the museum and they have to make a final decision. And so it's well to say, we could do this, we could do that, this is this problem, this is that ethical problem. But when push comes to shove, someone's going to go one way or the other. So, for example, with the Dutch case, I want you to know what you would tell your students about those photographs. Somebody had to make a decision, and it's not enough just to say, we need to talk, we need to get involved. Somebody needs to make a decision. Or with the Anderson Gallery, I think it would be good to, part of what your job would be to write the memo to the president of the university saying, this is what we suggest. Or with the Holocaust Museum, what are the, here's the memo that outlines our new policy, kind of thing. That pushing that next step beyond discussing the possibilities and saying, let's make some decisions or put the students in the position of making decisions is something that I think is useful.
I think your point is really important for me, one of the most important when we talk about ethics, and also something, what you're touching actually, is actually what are the principles upon ethical decision-making is based. And we can see also that for me, ethics, and when we talk about codes of ethics, and I mean, this is just a reference because these principles, they need to be internalized and shared and discussed. And actually, for me, these are the only, actually, this is the only scale or the ground that can inform professionals, that can inform professionals on a sustainable basis. When we think of, and then coming back to your comment before, and then I always wonder when I think of this case is actually what are the principles, but very basic principles. And maybe we even could be talking about something that we always discuss with our students because, for example, with this Dutch case and other cases, we ask them to do some stakeholder analysis and think of solutions, what they could do, but always trying to find these principles. And one of the issues that came up, maybe it's a good idea for discussion, maybe it's not so good idea, such a good idea, is this idea of intention, outputs, and outcomes. So intention, your result of what you intend, and actually the consequence of that in society. When we see cases, real cases, you see many times the curator, for example, we had another exhibition in Amsterdam about black people in art. So the intention of the curator was really good. She wants to show how black people are beautiful in the paintings. But when she was talking about black people, she was mainly thinking of the color. She wasn't thinking of the social circumstances of having those black people in the paintings. And we thought it was really strange, and we called like a whole meeting in the school, and we had this discussion, and she came to talk to us. And we actually were expecting someone really evil and really nice, and she really put on the table her intentions, and we see, okay, so it's not about the intention. Intention is not enough. And then the result of that was that exhibition. So is that actually where you find your principles? Is that where you find let's say, the basis of what makes something ethical or not. And then you say, okay, if you see that exhibition, maybe the results, it's strange. But by having the exhibition, actually you have different outcomes that you make people discuss. So maybe the result's not that good, but the consequence of that is good. And because of the discussion we had, they start thinking about that. So maybe something for discussion, actually, where do you place actually the main principles for for ethical decision making? Is it the intention of a curator museum? It's actually in your output, so how your exhibition looks like, how your products look like, or the outcomes of that in society? And then coming back to what you said, so why are you doing that, what for, etc. That's when I think we move more to this whole idea of social responsibility.
So maybe what is missing is also an ethicist on the panel, and of course I've been kind of pushing for that, and next semester we will in fact have a team-taught course between an ethicist coming from philosophical ethics, from practical ethics, and a museum person, because I think none of us schooled sufficiently in ethical principles to kind of make these kind of decisions. The Hague case, why you're going with Mills, the no harm principle, then it's very clear that the director did the right thing. But then, of course, there are other ethical theories too.
You should look actually in the outcome of your actions, actually what makes it ethical or not. But then Kant would say, well, you cannot predict how others will react. So I completely agree with you. It's more like a very logical principle behind all these ideas.
I want to I'm Jürgen Heinrichs from the program here, from the MA program. I wanted to thank Janet and our student workers for doing all this wonderful work, bringing this conference here, and also the intergenerational dialogue, which I think is very important. And regarding what's missing, I know that this probably sounds very ambitious, but I know that this conference and its goals are also very ambitious. So the way I like to preface this, I just would like to raise a couple of observations that came to mind today. Museums as an agent or a vehicle of social change, it's a very ambitious goal, because I remember Linda Nochlin, one of my professors, once, I think it's in one of publications, she said, there's this line, I wish I had it now, let's make no mistake, art or museums, for most people in most periods of the world, have never had the luxury of indulging in it. So museums haven't been on the forefront of social change, but much has changed, but much more needs to be done. And in terms of today's talks, very interesting, the legal presentations, the Farley-Garcia question, but in the end, I think we need to contextualize it and to broaden it, because it's very interesting. What if Farley had asked Manny Garcia about the photograph, the rights? But I think what's more important than the legal question is for museums and for academics to raise the broader question, if you look at that picture of Obama and hope and change, to continue to work as agents of critical analysis, because we live in a world with many problems. And Alain Badiou calls it the murderous division of the world in two. And this is what I liked about your talk, Lydie, I think. If you think, for instance, of Africa, that a lot is happening, but let's not kid ourselves that most Africans couldn't even go to Venice or to Kassel or to New York City and so forth. So there are many problems in the world. So number one, the hope issue. What about the state of our current world and the state of change? And look at the current policies, not just in the US, but also Europe. Interesting, for instance, the example of Holland and the issue of slavery. It's interesting, but in the end, we're all implicit in the current order, and I think that would also be important to point this out. Manchester, Pete Brown's, I haven't been to Liverpool, but I wonder if perhaps the rivalry could have to do with the fact that it's a post-industrial city, that many people are robbed of what used to give them meaning, and that suddenly this discovery takes on such large symbolic meaning. And what then does it mean in terms of the role of museums? Glenn Watton's wonderful presentation, we already talked over lunch, I thought it was so interesting that his example also is a case of appropriation, very problematic one, of a Roman emperor figure that then the sort of former natives embrace. What does it all mean? And it's a wonderful moment when the Christian and the native blessing is given. But to what extent is our multiculturalism today in these moments really able to keep up with the real problems of the world and the way, for instance, if you look at Congo right now, there was a report that the Belgian mine owner and Chinese companies exploit the mines in return for schools and highways. And in some ways, it's almost like colonialism all over again. So what is our role in it, and also as museums? And, oh yes, the other, Amelia, I think, the presentation about the use of Flickr, the US Holocaust Museum. We also discussed this in my museum technologies class. There's a very interesting study to what extent there is all this buzz, but in the end, a researcher found that 6,000 people who signed up on Facebook or Twitter to help starving African children only mustered to bring up, what, $2,000 or $3,000 in actual aid. So that's why he called it slacktivism. And I think there are a lot of things, to conclude here, there are a lot of things to do, and museums, yeah, there's a lot of work to do.
I guess I took Janet's question in a much more limited sense in terms of what's missing, specific topics. And one topic that obviously is in the news recently, in fact, I noticed your little efflux, whatever an efflux thing is, email today, is conflict of interest issues in museums. Now, these are primarily discussed with regard to art museums, but there are many other kinds. I mean, the occasion recently of the Biennial collection being shown at the New Museum in the spring, and kind of this front page article in the New York Times and all over the blogs about ethical issues involved with trustees showing their collections, et cetera, which is kind of, once again in the news, it comes up every once in a while, but kind of a broad discussion of that and of the relation of private collections and museum collections, not only historically, but in terms of the ethical issues they raise, not only in the most clear cases, but most interesting in the ones that you really don't know what to say.
I was very surprised when we did our call not to see anything on business ethics at all or conflicts of interest. I was extremely surprised not to see anything. And that seemed like a huge absence to me, a huge absence. And it seems like oftentimes the people that work on business ethics don't talk to the people that, that work on other kinds of ethics issues. And I see it as a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, in discussing these issues, I mean, I think one thing that is important and that you're able to do in the context of a classroom that often one cannot do in a newspaper because the articles are so short and they're generally polemical one way or another, is to really discuss how difficult these cases are and how, they just can't be dismissed by, well, museums should not deal with private collections that way. And it's in looking at, as I said before, kind of all the gray areas that and how practice changes over time and how that's influenced by different conditions of collecting, et cetera, that I think really interesting cases come out. And that's what can be done in the classroom through discussion and is generally not done in the press.
First, in response to what's missing, but I understand why it would be missing today and not at the next conference, is the impact of the issues that have been illuminated here on actual museum studies curriculum. How is this dialogue going to find its way into the courses in museum studies programs? My other response has to do with the question of ownership and also with the question of placing this discussion in the broader disciplinary conversation about ethics. The question about ownership really seems to fall squarely in the domain of whether, not in this case persons, but objects should be considered ends in themselves or means to an end, which is really what Bruce was talking And then in terms of the response to the question from the audience, it occurs to me today in listening to all these papers that the museum is just an ideal place to look at how different models of doing ethics collide in interesting ways. A rule-based ethics on the one hand, and that includes legislation, it includes the law, it includes codes. And then on the other hand, a situational ethics, which includes consequences and utilitarian interests. So museum ethics really does engage the larger conversation in ethics going back centuries, and I think could probably help that conversation along because we're talking about very concrete things.
I have, but I'm not really following along this track, so if anyone wants to take that. I have another thing that I just wanted to say. Anyone else?
I would just say, in response to Bettina, too, that it's very interesting to me that even the kind of rule-based ethics I find changing over time, that ethics codes, I see more and more of these becoming living, breathing ethics codes, that people that are writing ethics codes, committees that are writing ethics codes now, are writing ethics codes that they know, understand, acknowledge, that they have to revisit more often, that they have to evaluate more often, that they have to bring in more diverse stakeholders to constantly rethink them, and that these are dynamic things. So even that concept that you write this and then it's just static is really starting to change.
I wanted to comment on the skill set idea that you mentioned, Bettina, which I think ties in with the other thing that I wanted to say, which is as museums, and it's very exciting to talk about different voices and museums as agents of social change, and this will require a different or an additional skill set on the part of people who go to work in museums, because dealing with community, dealing with negotiation, dealing with conflict resolution, these are all skills that we don't necessarily specifically train people for at this time. But also, it's important to also balance this out with the fact that museums still have a primary mission to research their collections, to create new knowledge, that being an agency of social change is only part of their portfolio. It's just like all artists are not going to be social activists. All artists are not responsible for creating a better world. Some of them just make art. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm just wanted to bring that up as something that's sort of easy to, I mean, we assume it, but it can easily be overshadowed by all these other more exciting new things.
At the risk of getting out of my depth in response to that, there is, but I think can speak back to the issue of what's the role of museums as agents of social change, or if not, yes, some museums like that can, you could say, some museums have the intention of being, activist or, wanting to be agents of social change for whatever reason, just like artists can also, and some may just want to be museums. But I would argue that
It doesn't have to be one or the other.
No, but I'm also saying is that even those that say they just want to be museums, or those artists that say they just want to make art, are in fact also agents of some kind of social results, even if it's not of social change per se. They are all themselves agents as well as their art being agents. And so we could see the museum, willing or not, or intentioned or not, are in fact agents of some kind of social, meanings, agendas, changes, et cetera, and that we have to, and that isn't it really, the ethical thing is to actually try to be mindful of those things, and as we develop programming, make decisions, et cetera, as opposed to trying to say that we can't, we're not doing that so we can avoid the problem issue, you know what I mean?
Well, no, that wasn't at all what I was suggesting, but I think that the other part of their mission, which is, well, equally important to my way of thinking, is can tend to be lost in the shuffle. And, agents of social change is also, some museums have the capacity to be agents for social change on a larger scale, whereas others do not. They have to have more focused goals in order to be successful.
Well, and just to piggyback off of that, I mean, I think that it's still something that is indeed still developing, and so it's not a kind of one-size-fits-all type thing. And I think each institution and each, historic site or museum is going to really need to approach that differently for that specific space and that specific time for that particular group that they're dealing with. Just to sort of piggyback off of what you were talking about, I mean, experience that I was engaged in directly at the African Burial Ground is as we just headed into these public scoping meetings that happened over the summer, there was this Justice and Sustainability Associates was basically a civic engagement consulting firm that was brought in to work directly with the staff and the volunteers at the burial ground to really engage us in scenarios that could potentially happen when we go out and go into the community and engage the community in a history of a very sensitive history that is going to really basically, conjure up or bring back out, very specific topics or very sort of painful history that when that burial ground was rediscovered had all kinds of implications or different kinds of issues. And being able to work with this particular consulting company really helped to train the staff and the volunteers of what we were about to head into. And I think this is sort of part of this kind of new wave of management and engagement with the community, and also preparing the staff on the museum level or the institutional level of exactly how to deal with that once you go out.
A new skill set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Studies programs is also, thinking back to my days when I was a graduate student at Winterthur, is our need to have really diverse student bodies within our graduate programs. And the more different kinds of viewpoints we can have coming from the students within those programs, more different kinds of people from diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures, diverse groups, diverse economic backgrounds, I think we can start to build in more sensitivity into museums within staffs, because we'll have people moving in who just have different viewpoints, as opposed to, one predominant one, which is often the way in many museums.
One thing that I am thinking a lot about right now, too, also is on the institutional level, what are the boundaries and what is the overlap between personal ethics and institutional ethics? So where do we define the ethics of the museum? And can an institution have an ethics? Yes, it does. Because, people leave. So, but yet at the same time, the individual also does create the ethics. So how does that all work? And it's really important to think about this when you go into institutions, and how your own personal ethics helps to create that institutional ethics. But at the same time, there is an institutional ethics at work. So it's a very, very complicated dynamic, very, very complicated.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of this is that how do these ethics play out, personal and institutional, within general societal perceptions of what's ethical and what isn't. And we have lots of examples of ethical but a lot of unethical behavior that's right out there in our face. And I think this does change public perceptions of what's acceptable and what is, what we can just let go by. And that may not be the best way for museums to function.
It's interesting because haven't we just witnessed a colossal breakdown of ethics in the world of business and politics, if you think of Guantanamo and the secret prisons in Europe and so forth? Number one. Number two, if you look at museum literature, Twitchell's branding, museums' desperate attempt to shape themselves according to corporations, the whole branding and so forth. I'm not contradicting it, but I'm thinking we also need to be very critical, because museums in the recent past have not exactly been in the avant-garde of, providing critical alternatives. So, and when it comes to the ethics, I think a lot of work really needs to be done, because so far they have often been just following the mainstream. And they are not great examples right now in business or politics to follow.
I think it's also along those lines that the policies, the law and policies that museums develop is always reactive, or it seems to be always reactive, instead of being forward-thinking about how we would like to shape the world. These policies that are created that then lawyers like me look to say you ought to do it this way are being created in a reactive sense to crises as they happen.
I think I understand what you mean, but I disagree a little bit. I think that ethics, it's becoming each time more important, but it has a different role in society. Also in museums, and then coming back to what Janet said, it's personal ethics, and I'd like also to emphasize this idea of sharing and negotiating. I think we as stakeholders, as professionals, as individuals, we have a different role now in actually agree on what on the ethical grounds. Not in society, well, not everybody, of course, but if you think of grassroots movements, social movements, I'm from Latin America, so it makes a lot of sense where I come from, but also in the heritage field and museums field, that is the whole idea of the stakeholders. So I think ethics, actually, we shouldn't look for models for ethics in these big structures, but really this idea of sharing and negotiating personal ethics, personal worldviews, and creating something collective, also inside an institution.
It's very interesting. I mean, I'm probably not the right person to ask about where I think ethics should be in the curriculum, because I'm writing a textbook, But what I would say is it's very interesting to look across the business curriculum, bioethics, all of these other things, and to see how ethics is being folded in, and also how it's being added as separate courses, Certainly I feel that, particularly, you look at the conversation we've been having today, that it seems like ethics is something that's absolutely essential if we want to change our museums. That it's absolutely essential to add to our curriculum, both folded in and as separate courses, that it's absolutely essential. And, in my, kind of anecdotal, kind of looking at curricula, it's, I'd say maybe a third of the programs have some kind of, ethics education. But, it just seems to me that, that there is a general thirst for it among young people. And, how it's done is a very kind of interesting thing. But certainly there seems to be a broad curiosity for it in any case.
I'm so fascinated by the fact, because now we're very much at the Rijnwaard also working with archival studies and library studies, etc., being heritage broad and not only museums. And when I talk about professional ethics, somebody from the archival science comes and talks about their professional code, and other professionals come and they talk about their own professional code, and then I can only say, coming from this museums background, is that I don't have a professional code. And I understand that the museum context is very, very diverse. There's this huge difference being at the front office and being in the back office, and those people mostly don't speak the same language. So it's difficult then to have this museum professional code, but I would be interested, because you were reflecting upon the fact that there is this personal code. I would be so interesting if there are any thoughts or initiatives to make this museum code for the museum professional, that I am a museum professional, like I'm a doctor or I'm an archivist, and that I am 24 hours a day, because we don't work from our postgraduate moment till our pension in the same museum. I mean, we change, we are very international, we take our own things with us, but is that also ethically allowed? What do you do, what do you don't do? So I'm interested in if but that's an all different topic. If you would be interested in making this professional code for us as museum professionals, and would that be a solution?
But the American Association of Museums has a very extensive professional code. Extensive, many pages. So does ICOM.
And in fact, individual museums are mandated by AAM to formulate their own versions.
No,
for
she's
this.
not talking about museum codes, about museum profession.
Me as a professional, I'm not, I don't see myself in the museum code of ethics. Only in the last paragraph I'm addressed to. And I find that very strange.
I would like to say a thing to this. Obviously, it's very important, and I welcome Janet's point of sort of a wedding because personal and institutional ethics. But I would also want to be a bit more critical, because especially, particularly in the United States, what you often see is large systemic problems. Look at all the things with mortgages and people with credit cards. But then there's this all-American narrative of pull yourself up by your bootstrings that makes something individual and personal that is in fact systemic. And that begs systemic analysis. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have personal ethics. I would like to revisit another example from Amelia Wong's excellent presentation that also, I think it's one of the major accomplishments here to realize the complexity of the Flickr, Twitter, Facebook, which, as we also in my class discuss, is always hailed as the arrival of a new generation. Finally, everybody has a voice, no longer the grand master narrative. Everybody can talk back. And your example was such an interesting one in which you were faced with a dilemma. What do you do when you find these offensive comments? Was it Flickr? And do you delete them, which you did, but that also isn't, I found that a really insightful moment, and obviously there's no solution. But it does make us aware that these are really systemic problems and issues that we need to tend to, and we need to be really careful of not falling for that all new social media are necessarily great and alternative and agents of social change.
Yeah, thank you. I think it involves looking at the context and case-by-case basis, of course, but I think with any ethical context, really getting in there and getting your hands dirty to see what the limitations and opportunities are, because it's easy to judge something new based on your perceptions of what's good and bad about old technologies, but it shifts and changes all the time, and you really have to be in it. And that issue of a living code of ethics that Janet mentioned earlier, of course, for me in my role at the Museum in Technology, made me think of wikis and how you see these used a lot more in academia, especially among scientists and humanists who are working out collaborative ways of using these technologies that allow collaborative writing and storing versions of texts so that you can see argumentation built into those processes. But then there's always the issues of, you don't want everything out there. And you learn that as you experiment in these places, what you are comfortable with as a person versus a professional. And I do know of many museum professionals who are keeping personal and professional lives separately on these platforms for those reasons. So.
Any other questions, comments? No. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We really appreciate it. Any last Q&As for Alex and for Steve? Please put them in our question box and sign up for our listserv. Come to Fred Wilson's lecture, and we appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.